The Door in the Wall and Other Stories is a collection of short stories by famed science fiction author H.G. Wells, illustrated with photogravures by Alvin Langdon Coburn. It was first published in 1911 in New York in a limited edition of 600 copies. It was subsequently published in London in 1915 in a limitation of only 60 copies that were quite special insofar as they were signed by both Wells and Coburn. For those mortals who can't stretch to the cost of one of those rare signed editions, the Folio Society in 2016 published a limited edition facsimile in a limitation of 1,000 copies, and it's one of those facsimile copies that I will be looking at here today. Like many of Folio's best limited editions, the book comes in a Solander box rather than a slipcase, and that's something I do quite enjoy. It makes the experience of taking the book out just that little bit special. And the box is bound in this nice brown cloth. It feels very sturdy, and we see on the front board that we have the title here blocked in gilt along with the name of the book's two contributors. And then here in a slightly debossed frame, we have one of Alvin Langdon Coburn's images. The spine of the Solander box is also blocked in gilt. Now we open the box out, and we see inside is this little pocket, which is used to secure a small commentary volume in place. More on that in just a moment. The box is lined here in this brown paper. And then over on the right, if we open out these tissue guards, we see the volume itself. So let's take that out and have a closer look. It's bound in facsimile of the original, meaning it has these brown paper sides and is quarter bound in brown book cloth with a white title label on the spine. The front board is blocked in gilt with the title and contributors' names in a way that catches the light and really looks quite impressive with a nice warm glow. Opening the front cover, we are immediately confronted with the paper on which the volume is printed. This is a German mold-made paper in a warm ivory colour. It is relatively lightweight, which helps to keep the book also of modest weight despite its size, and therefore comfortable, I found, for laptop reading. But it has this nice canvas-like texture to it. It feels very pliable, and altogether the paper is a real tactile delight to handle. Paper was an absolute highlight of this edition for me. I liked it very much. Here is a facsimile of the page, which was signed by both Wells and Coburn. And then we come to the main title spread. So here on the verso page, we have the first of Coburn's images. More on those in just a moment. And then facing it, we have this title page. We see here London Grant Richards, who published that 1915 edition. Otherwise, it's a fairly austere title page, which is quite typical of books of that period from around the turn of the 20th century. Here we have the table of contents, and we see that there are 8 short stories in this edition. Some of those are relatively well known, such as The Country of the Blind, which shows up in all sorts of collections of short stories and was also published in a nice edition by the Golden Cockerel Press. Some of them are a little bit more obscure, such as The Cone, which nevertheless I enjoyed very much. It was probably my favourite among the entire book. I think I'm correct in saying that the stories in this book were chosen from among Wells's stories by Coburn according to which of those stories he thought he could best illustrate with his images. That is to say, these are not necessarily Wells's best short stories, but rather the ones that most suited the purposes of the artist. There are 10 illustrations in total. That's because 2 of the stories each have 2 illustrations, those being The Door in the Wall and The Country of the Blind, and the other 6 stories have 1 illustration each. And then we go right into the first story, The Door in the Wall. We have this nice engraved headpiece here, and then all of the stories open also with a nice engraved drop cap, which brings a bit of typographic richness to the book. The pages are set with these relatively large margins. Again, despite this being a relatively large book, it's therefore fairly easy to read. I didn't have any problems with the line length, for example. And the type design here was by Frederick Gowdy, and the typeface in this edition I think was specially designed for the book. So I will now leaf through the book and we'll get a chance to look at some of those photogravures by Alvin Langdon Coburn and the general layout of the book. So here's the next of these images. They've been reproduced on tatami paper. To my eye, the reproduction is good, but you shouldn't take my word for it. Down in the description, I'll put a link to a post by a user on the Folio Society devotees forum named Delphic Oracle, who has one of those 60 original copies, and he posted a nice side-by-side comparison of the two, and his verdict from close inspection was that indeed the reproductions here are very good. We should remember that these images date from the relatively early days of photography, and that gives them a slightly dreamy, washed-out quality. But I think that suits the atmosphere of these stories relatively well, in fact. As I go along, perhaps I can comment briefly on the stories themselves. As I said, the stories weren't all necessarily chosen for their literary merit, but there are a few gems among them. So the title story, The Door in the Wall, is a really nice, wistful tale of regret and missed opportunity. The Country of the Blind, I thought, had a very neat narrative arc and is justifiably perhaps the most famous of Wells's short stories. My personal favourite was The Cone, which is an intensely atmospheric tale of revenge set in a Victorian industrial hellscape. Some of the stories I was a little bit less enamoured by. So A Moonlight Fable, as the name implies, was written in the form of a fable, and I didn't think the style suited Wells very much at all. The Lord of the Dynamos might be a little bit shocking to modern readers because it's a story with overt racist undertones. But overall, these are nice, quick reads, and there's a good amount of variety among the stories here. So that's the end of the book. Then we arrive at the Colophon page. We see first of all the Colophon from the original edition, and then the new Colophon for this Folio Society edition. This tells us that it's been produced in Spain, it was printed in Germany by Lachenmayer, and that this is one of 1,000 copies. Lastly, we have this commentary volume. It is soft bound in brown paper and is blocked in gilt on the front. We see here that we have essays by George Hendrick and David Lodge. If we open it out, there's only one illustration in this volume, and that's the frontispiece here, which is another photograph by Alvin Langdon Coburn, this time of H.G. Wells. And then turning to the contents page, we see that we have essentially 3 parts to this volume. So the first is a short essay by George Hendrick, which gives a kind of narrative history of the collaboration between Wells and Coburn. Then we have a more critical essay by David Lodge about the images themselves and how those 10 images came to sit alongside the 8 stories in this volume. And then lastly, we have a collection of Alvin Langdon Coburn's letters to H.G. Wells and his wife, in which Coburn talks about the images he's making and attempts to persuade Wells to take a look at those and agreed to have them used alongside his stories. So it's a fairly short, simple commentary volume, but it does suffice to give some nice context to this relatively nice Folio Society facsimile edition of The Door in the Wall and Other Stories by H.G. Wells.